morning, everybody. So glad that you are joining us for this month's special Liftoff Conversations of the Future, provided by Foundation for the Future. It's going to be such an exciting episode this week because we are going to be talking about living in space, which we all know someday is going to be happening. It's just the question of when we get to have more of us up there as astronauts or maybe vacationers. And so, what I'll do is we'll go around the room, we'll talk a little bit about your favorite hosts, and then we'll get you some really great interviews today. So, I'll start off. I am Meredith Rocket Girl Garofalo, the singing meteorologist, your TV broadcasting meteorologist and reporter that is in love with space and science and STEM. So I'm really excited to be one of our hosts. We are going to talk in the Rocket Girl Report today, which is something that we have every single episode with a very special guest who is actually in the same town I'm recording from of Cleveland, Ohio. So I'll introduce her in a little bit. But we also have Daniel and Ubaldo.
Hi, everybody. Yes, welcome to the show. I'm very excited about this topic, as I think most, if not all of us, would love to live in space at some point in our lifetime. So I myself am working for a space startup called Cislunar Industries. I'm their chief of staff, working towards making that a possibility. That's what brings me here, is kind of bringing the news and excitement of what's really happening on the ground in the space industry out to the public, right? Because I think, one of the things that's missing and has been missing is this knowledge, this kind of general knowledge of what's going on, because there's so much going on, especially in the last 5 years. And that's really part of our mission on Liftoff, is to bring that to kind of the general populace, right? Because we want to invite you all in to give your voices to what we're trying to do as humanity, and reach out to the moon, to Mars, and beyond. We need all those voices. We need all your voices. So thank you all for being here, and we're really excited to have this conversation. And I hand the baton to Daniel, in keeping with the Olympics that just happened in Paris, the incredible Olympics.
Well, I'm Daniel Tompkins, doctor of plant medicine, so plant pathology, anthropology, soil and water science. And so living in space, definitely, I think of plants, right? How do plants live in space? How do all the biological processes work in space? And to kind of reuse what Frank White often uses is, who wants to go to space? We're already in space, right? Earth is in space. We're where is the line, especially in the grandness of the universe. So excited to have this conversation about how we can live in space.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I'm so excited about this episode. And Ubaldo, I know for your segment, you've got something exciting to kick us off today.
Yeah, so let's start out with that. So Samuel Coniglio, some of you may know him. He is an author. I was going to combine all of his titles into one. He's an author and a retrofuturist. His website is retro-futurist.com. But he published a book recently this year called Creature Comforts in Space. And we talk a little bit about, what does that mean? And we focus on the word enjoyable, which I would love to talk with, the panel here today, the guests that we have here today, about that aspect of this. So let's tune into the Space Ace report, and then we'll be back for our live discussion. All right, hi everybody. This is Ubaldo, the Space Ace Ciminieri, and for my segment today, considering that we're talking about living in space, I wanted to bring someone who I've had the chance to get to know over the last year. We always run into each other at all the conferences, and it's, his work speaks directly to what we're talking about this episode. So Samuel Coniglio is a space futurist, a writer, photographer, inventor, and a space industry advocate. His new book, Creature Comforts in Space, guides designers to create an enjoyable and sustainable off-world lifestyle on board next generation space stations. So we're going to talk about that, particularly the enjoyable part. But first of all, Sam, hello. How are you?
Hello. How are you, sir? Doing good.
I'm good. Yeah, good. Good. Now, yeah, we're good. We're having fun talking about, all of these amazing things that are happening in the space industry, as you know. But what we wanted to talk about with you today was this idea of living in space. So, quick background on you and how you got to do this work.
Well, some hobbies become passions, and I've been doing this for a long time. But quick backgrounder, earliest days of my career, I started working at the Kennedy Space Center, working out with McDonnell Douglas, worked on space shuttle and space station programs. I was a technical writer doing documentation. I still am a technical writer to this day. Worked on a variety of really cool projects there. But in the 1990s, there was an unusual side project that McDonnell Douglas signed up for that our team, our division, got involved in as well. It was called the Delta Clipper Experimental. And the Delta Clipper Experimental was a fully reusable rocket ship, which most people don't even know exists. Hey, look, I'll prop. Here's a picture of me in front of the DCX. Let's see if I get the light again.
Awesome.
But there you go. So this is a fully reusable rocket ship. It was built in 18 months with the McDonnell Douglas team diversified all over, Huntington Beach, St. Louis, Florida, all over the country. Different teams were working on it on a very tight budget, like $90 to $95 million. That was about it to build this thing. It was sponsored by the Department of Defense, and it was proving the idea of a rocket taking off and landing. Amazing.
Right.
This is the 1990s. Now, because there was like almost no budget and because it was a DoD project, not a NASA project, it got almost no media coverage. Very few people heard about it. And if there were a couple reporters there, they misinterpreted it as a NASA project, which it wasn't. There's a long story behind it. And if you guys do some research on Wikipedia and other places, you can find out more. But this project inspired me to learn more about the private side of the space industry, not just NASA, because for decades, since, the Apollo program, all that, NASA was the go-to place for any type of space activity, humans in space, robots in space, satellites, blah, blah, blah. It was NASA, 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 which was fine. The problem is there were a lot of entrepreneurs who wanted to do new things, creative things, maybe alternative space stations, alternative spacecraft, other ways of living and doing things in space. But NASA had a lock. They had a monopoly on all things space. And these private entrepreneurs could not get funding, could not get support by any private investor or venture capital or anything like that back in the day. So from the 80s, 90s, 2000s, there were it was a struggle. There was an organization called the Space Frontier Foundation that was formed. That was a ragtag band of libertarian entrepreneurialists who love space, who wanted to build spaceships and do rockets and things like that. And they worked together. And they had competitions, and they lobbied Congress to change the rules to make it a little bit easier for private industry to get more involved with the space industry. It was a decades-long struggle. Lori Garver has a book I recommend that talks about this. She was like a former NASA deputy administrator. She was in the middle of the battle during the Obama administration to allow private industry such as SpaceX to get contracts from NASA and from the DoD for private alternatives to private industries to fly. Because for decades, there were 5 companies that were pretty much dominated the aerospace industry. McDonnell Douglas, Lockheed Martin, Boeing. These were the companies that were part of the original Apollo program, and they latched onto NASA and never left. And they had these cost plus contracts where they just worked on the project for 20 years. There was no rhyme or reason about getting it done quickly. Just, we'll get it done eventually. And so people had their entire careers locked into this thing because they kept getting money from NASA, kept getting money from the DoD to work on these various space projects. Great. Outsiders, no, could not get support, couldn't get funding. You could become a subcontractor maybe, and that's it. So I dived deep into this world of the Space Frontier Foundation. And right around the same time, I was realizing, what? Why can't this whole space thing be more open to the general public? Why can't you and I go into space more too? So around the same time, I got involved with a group called the Space Tourism Society. It's founded by a guy named John Spencer, and it's based in Los Angeles. And it was a group looking at the future of space experiences, what we can do on Earth, in the air, in low Earth orbit, or in deep space with general people who are not astronauts, who are not superheroes, who have 5 PhDs and are super fit or
Right.
ex-military, all that stuff.
Yeah.
You know, can you and I go? Is that possible? And this was in the 1990s, okay?
Wow.
And when the phrase space tourism came out, we were shunned by NASA and other aerospace groups left, right, and center, because if it's not science, if it's not NASA, it doesn't exist. It cannot exist, cannot be. I know we're going to talk about Doritos in space today, but did you know that
Yes.
Pizza Hut did a commercial in space in 2001?
Did they really? No. I mean, I probably saw it, but wow.
Pizza Hut wanted to do the commercial with NASA, but NASA had these very strict rules that they could not be biased towards any commercial entity. It still exists today, and they
Right.
could not have any commercials of any kind on NASA property, which means the commercial that was done for Pizza Hut and Lego and a couple other groups in the 1990s and early 2000s was done by the Russians on the Russian side of the International Space Station.
Right, right.
Russians were doing it, and the commercials were only shown in Europe.
How amazing.
Yeah. And this is how strong the anti-business mindset of NASA was all these years.
Right.
Intentional or not, they pretty much slowed down the pace of the entire space industry that we know of today. And it
Yep.
took decades of fighting with the Space Frontier Foundation and individuals inside NASA trying to allow new opportunities, new organizations. Blue Origin, SpaceX, all those groups would not exist without the fighting that the foundation did and with certain individuals inside of NASA to allow new opportunities.
Right.
The X Prize was another example.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
Man has created that. The whole idea of the and the X Prize Foundation, it took many years because they started in 1996, inspired by DCX again. But it took like many years, like till 2004, to get enough funding to raise that $10 million prize to find and someone who could fly a vehicle up and down the space to the edge of space. They did it. Burt Rutan, awesome guy, amazing designer. I've been in Mojave several times, visit this facility. Amazing stuff. So X Prize was another key catalyst for this change, adding competitions into the process of allowing people who are not NASA engineers create ideas and build them and fly them.
Well, and you know, and I love that. Thank you for that history, because you know it's you know, I would say what the last 5-7 years is when we've really started to see this space industry, this commercial space industry, this private space industry boom. And but yet a lot of people still don't know about that, right? It's still sort of, there's kind of this legacy secrecy that gets pulled from NASA and the Apollo era, as you talk about. But I think you and I both believe, and there's a large group of people in this industry who believe that in order for us to actually live in space as human beings, we need everybody's voice. We need everybody to, you know, kind of give their thoughts on that, whether they want to go to space or not. But the more diverse voices we can get, the more of the general populace who doesn't know what's going on knows about what's going on, you know, the more they can be a part of this decision that we're making as humanity to say, yeah, we want to expand out beyond spaceship Earth. You know, we want to go to the next town over the moon and then Mars and beyond. And what does that mean? I don't know. Do you agree with that? Like, do you think we need that diversity of voices? We need everybody, not necessarily everybody, but more people on planet Earth to be behind that?
Oh, you can't bring humanity in space unless you bring humanity into space.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
The National Space Society has their space settlement competition they do every year, where they have people design space stations and Mars bases and stuff like that. And they're great technically, but they kind of forget the human element. They forget that we are people.
Right.
We have habits. We are a very diverse group, many different colors, many different sexual orientations, many different types of backgrounds, many types of experiences. And if we want to bring humanity into space, we have to bring humanity into space, which means we need to look at a bigger picture of bringing, making food better tasting, being able to do your laundry in space, being able to do basic things that you do every day at home to work out there in the cosmos. I believe we will never make it to Mars, and we will never make it to the moon as bases or settlements until we figure out the fundamentals. And that is what my book, Creature Comforts in Space, is all about. Talking about the fundamentals of living. And I talk about creature comforts because we have not addressed many of the basic fundamental issues. Wouldn't it be nice to take a shower once in a while?
Yeah.
Nice to wash your clothes in space. Little things like that. I mean, I love tea. I drink lots of tea, and wouldn't it be nice to actually have the flavor back? Because when you're microgravity, your tongue swells up, your nose swells up, and you lose your taste buds. You lose the sense of smell. You lose the sense of flavor. And the NASA Kitchen Laboratory has worked on it a little bit, but there needs to be a lot more research on how to improve the taste of food and the variety of food, how to process the food, how to cook it, how to clean the dishes, how to do preparation. Can we grow food in space? Can we create systems akin to like a Star Trek replicator where you can automate the whole process?
Right.
All these different little elements I talk about in the book, by the way, which we need to address more. And there's a lot of overlap with down-to-earth situations. I go to this desert festival called Burning Man. It's a camping event first, party second, but it's a camping event first in a very harsh environment. Dust storms, extreme heat, dehydration. I mean, everything's trying to kill you. And yet we go. And guess what? Humans are very resourceful. For millennia, we have traveled to the deserts. We've traveled to the Arctic. We've traveled to the mountains. We've gone underwater. Humans are very adaptable species. We can find innovative ways to survive in all sorts of environments. Well, guess what? Space is the ultimate extreme environment.
Yep. Everything it wants, everything it's going to throw at us is something we've never experienced before. And I feel like, that's certainly why these things have taken a back seat to, first of all, getting us there and protecting us from radiation or whatever it might be. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, to your point, we're going to want to drink on the moon, right? We're going to want to have sex on the moon. Like that, those are basic human things that either we prepare for it, like strategically and officially, or it's going to happen anyway. And then you're going to have to deal with the fallout, right? And so, For All Mankind is such a fun show to watch, and because they address the at least the drinking part, last season. You have an underground bar that basically opens up on base, and they're making their own illegal alcohol. Like, why don't we plan for that better? I mean,
I just had a very uncomfortable conversation with someone on LinkedIn. I had to block him because he was like a pure scientist athlete guy who was always worried about, everything about being pure science, pure biology, and alcohol should never be in space and all these other issues. And I was like, dude, human beings have been making booze for millennia. We've been drinking booze for millennia. Guess what? The Russians are prescribed cognac for space because their doctor says it's a medicinal.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. And guess what? Some astronauts drink it too. Shh.
I mean,
but we have these taboos. There's another thing that you don't know about are the taboos. Two big taboos for space and NASA: sex and booze.
Isn't that funny?
You can't talk about those things. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. 3, space tourism. 3 taboos.
Sure.
I have been shunned from conferences. I have been banned. I have been exonerated by official experts in the industry because I've talked about things. I wrote papers on sex and space 10 years ago. My whole book here is about drinking and all this stuff. And well, not just drinking, but life in general.
Right.
I designed a zero gravity cocktail glass to see if you can manage the fluid flow of any type of liquid. It could be water, it could be juice, it could be booze, whatever, in a cup that doesn't have a lid. So I was experimenting with that type of stuff. I built robots that serve cocktails, learned about fluid flow and fluid mechanics to get, The drink's over here, the bottle's over here, the glass is over here. We're gonna mess, but in space, it's a bigger mess because you have blobs. All the
Right.
liquids float into spheres and blobs, and they stick to everything.
Right. Right. Yeah. And that's just what, and I love where this conversation's going, because this is an important aspect. Like we're never we're never going to live in space until we address everything. And the human hasn't generally been in the loop when creating everything from spaceships to, other things, right? The cockpit itself, maybe even, it's like the human piece of it comes in after the fact, because the science and the technical have taken the forefront of that design and creation for,
And that's the other issue, is that we've been in an engineering oriented mindset for so long
yeah.
that we forgot about these other elements. We think, oh, we don't need a shower. We just simply use baby wipes in your set and you're ready to go.
Yeah. Right.
What they're doing. We need designers. We need artists, heaven forbid, artists, creative people to be working with the engineers to design new types of structures and systems. There are people called industrial designers. That's what they do. They create products, they create systems, they create these things here, they need to exist. Why don't we have them working with the engineers? Because the engineers can do a lot of good creative stuff too.
Sure.
But when you got to think out of the box, you need people who do that for a living. And that's where
architects,
scientists know that. That's why I go to Burning Man, because a lot of the art is a huge amount of engineering as well as art. When you have engineers and artists working together, magic happens.
Yeah.
I've seen some really stuff.
Totally agree. I mean, that's, I've heard people talk about even in analog astronauts. So let's just use here on Earth, having these very stale environments, right? These habitats. Wouldn't it be nice to just have a little bit of wood paneling on the wall, maybe, right? Like, let's bring interior designers into this, to your point, to create a place where, a place within a place that's trying to kill us that feels homely, right? Because it has impact on our psychology. It has impact on so many things that if we don't think that far ahead, then you're right. We're never going to make it to Mars or even the moon if we don't consider how that all of that's going to actually impact the human. And that's where I love the tagline of your book, especially the word enjoyable, because like why, it should be fun, right?
Exactly. We know there are things that are going to kill us. There's a ton of things that want to kill us, from the radiation to the vacuum to the microgravity to all these other things that are going to either maim us or kill us or whatever. So in my book, I say, okay, analyze these things as much as you can and turn them into design constraints. Not just a thing to fear or worry about, design constraints. Case in point, radiation. Okay, there's issues with radiation. How do we manage radiation? Polaris Dawn, by the way, this can be launching in a few days. Oh my God. They're going to be open a hatch with a brand new type of spacesuit, and they're going to experiment at a super high altitude in the Van Allen radiation belt and see what happens.
Right.
That's what we need to do. More of that. In my book, I talk about, can we use radiation as a tool? Can we use it? Life cycle system recycling of wastes, human wastes, as well as food wastes and all that stuff. And of course, you got to worry about germs and bacteria. So can you create a waste processing system where you briefly expose it to radiation, kills all the germs, close the hatch, and then you use what's left as fertilizer for an onboard space station garden? Because we need farming big time in space.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, man, gosh, we could talk about this forever. It's so cool. Thank you, for taking the time and kind of really highlighting not only the history of this, but why I think it just puts a fine point on why it's so important, this work that you're doing, the book, Creature Comforts in Space. Please, everybody go get it. Where can they go get it, by the way?
It's available on Amazon and BookBaby. So if you don't want to deal with the Amazon behemoth, bookbaby.com has it. It's actually store.bookbaby.com. Just Google it and you'll see it pop up. So you can
Okay.
get it on paperback form, Kindle form as well, as it's available on Amazon. Eventually will be more public. But, this is self-published, and I wanted it to be available at any bookstore anywhere physically, as well as being available online.
Love it. Where can
And,
people? Oh yeah, go ahead.
and I should mention, of course, my apologies
Yeah.
for interrupting.
No.
Go to retro-futurist.com.
Yes, thank you.
You get all the information about the book. You'll see some of my interviews, my presentations, some reports. You can learn more about me there. Retro-futurist.com.
Perfect. And they can find out where you're going to be too, because you go to a lot of wonderful conferences that you're a part of.
Sign up for my mailing list while you're there. You click on that
There you
button,
go.
you sign up, and I'll send you a little report. In fact, I got one coming. I gotta do one coming up for Burning Man, because it's like, oh my God. I'm not gonna
Oh,
do
nice.
Burning Man, but I'll do it like as soon as I get back. I'll say, here's my report. I just survived the desert, and here's why it's related to space. And
There you
I'll
go.
do that real quick. But coming up, I will be speaking at Maker Faire, which
Okay,
is
yeah.
a showcase of builders and inventors in Vallejo, California, Northern California, my backyard. And also coming up in November 1st and 2nd, the New Worlds Conference in Houston, Texas.
That's
Spaceport
right. It moved to Houston. That's exciting. Yes. Okay, cool.
Houston. So I'll be there November 1st, 2nd. Rick really wants me to run a session. We're going to get a bunch of interesting panelists involved, and I guess I'm the MC for that section. I was like, I
Hey,
have to figure out who I'm going to talk to. I'm begging if I get an astronaut or two, that'd be great, but we'll see what
there you go.
happens. And
Well,
yeah,
you'll have access to many, hopefully, in that area. So that's kind of good. That's awesome. Okay, great. So, all right, retro-futurist.com, Creature Comforts in Space. Thank you, Sam. It's so great to chat with you. Really appreciate it.
pleasure, sir. Great seeing you.
All right, take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
All right. Well, thank you again to Sam. He's incredible. What really got me with our interview was just the history behind these discussions, right, in this particular topic. I think it's quite fascinating. I'd love to dig in again with our guest today about, this idea that the topic of living in space as human beings was sort of a shunned discussion, back in the day, right? I mean, he started trying to have these conversations over 20 years ago, and agencies, NASA, he was shunned for that. They didn't want to talk about the creature comforts of living in space. They didn't want to talk about sex in space or alcohol in space or good food in space. And so, I think that's a topic area I'd love to dig in more as well. But yeah, let me turn it back over to Meredith, and we'll get going for the Rocket Girl report, right?
Oh, yes. The Rocket Girl report today is fantastic because we talk about somebody who actually had the experience of living in space without living in space, because the work that Martina does. So today, joining me for the Rocket Girl report, I'd like to introduce Martina Damasca. Martina is an awarded published research scholar, engineer, and pioneering figure in space exploration, both nationally and regionally, as well as internationally. Martina is the first Macedonian and female Balkan analog astronaut serving as commander on Lunaris MO8 Selene, serving on the ESA, or European Space Agency funded ICEE, Space and Astroland Interplanetary Agency, APICES, and also NASA-supported UNDA ILMAH 14. All cool stuff, right? She is a senior NASTAR ambassador with suborbital spaceflight certification and is internationally recognized space pioneer for all the distinguished programs, organizations, and entities that she's contributed to: Forbes, Bloomberg, Huffington Post, just to give you a few examples, UN Women, and just so many other notable situations that we're going to be talking about that she's been. Martina, thanks for joining us on the show today.
Wow, I am mind blown by your introduction. I I don't know what to say. Thank you so much. Yes, to put this into layman terms, I have served 3 missions, and consecutively I had so much human spaceflight training done for getting me ready for space. So yes, I would love to share more about my experiences, and I see amazing people with us today, from Eamon to Ubaldo to Meredith to everybody else like Daniel and Carl joining us. I'm so honored to meet you all. We had great chats before the podcast, and I'm really happy to continue this contribution.
Well, thank you, Martina. So I always like to start off the Rocket Girl report with just a little bit of a background, like the why you got into space, when you got bitten by the space bug. Because I think what's always interesting with space is some people, from the minute they're born, they want to do it, like I was with meteorology. But then there's other people that were bitten later in life by the space bug. So what would you say is your space intro?
So the first space intro is actually my mom sticking planets that glow in the dark on my wall and stars. I was really young, and that was my favorite thing. Whenever we repainted the walls, we had to stick the same planets because they were really hard to find. I come from a really small town, Kichevo, in Macedonia, that's in the Balkans. It's a country that's really small, around 1.5 to 2 million people, right above Greece. We never had a profound space industry. We don't have a space agency. We never launched astronauts. It's not a common theme there to be invested or involved in space. It's only a really narrow resource capacity that you can actually access if you want to educate yourself. And the Balkans, in a cultural way and in a lot of ways, it's kind of cut off from the world. It has their own type of a culture and ecosystem that's kept well in the area, and it's really hard to penetrate. So bringing space exploration to the Balkans is a bit challenging, but I was always a curious kid. I was somebody who always wanted to answer questions. The more difficult, the better. I wanted solving problems, and I was always a doubtful kid. I wanted to explore a theory or a subject from all angles and find the ultimate truth, as I call it. So upon my path for the ultimate pursuit of truth, I kind of stumbled onto the most pressing unanswered mysteries, which is connected to space exploration.
That's such a great story and so inspiring. So fast forward, here we are. And today, like I said, you're in the US, you're in the same town I am in.
Yes.
And to this day, just so everybody knows here, Martina and I actually met online through some mutual space friends. And so we've never met in person. And so we'll probably have to like document and put on social, like us meeting in person, because it's going to be amazing.
Yeah,
But why don't you tell us? Yeah, exactly. Why don't you tell us a little bit about, I know we mentioned analog astronaut, and many people think of the word astronaut, they think you have to go to space, you have to be in space, but yours is a little bit different, and you've actually got to simulate space missions without even leaving the planet.
Yes, exactly. So analog astronaut missions are missions conveyed on Earth that mimic space scenarios. They're there to test equipment. It's not logical for us to just launch things in space, right? You have to test them and make sure that the experiments are working, everything is durable, the habitats are working well and are fit for the role, and also the crew. The more diverse crew, the better for future objectives and research, right? So there's so many layers that we actually have to pre-test before we actually ever leave the planet. We have some space agencies testing satellites through so many conditions and so many ways, or other equipment, but this is human crews and human spaceflight that has to be tested in prolonged confinement, in prolonged stressors. Obviously, it is not ethical for us to mimic radiation on humans, so we cannot mimic that aspect of spaceflight, and we cannot really stimulate zero gravity on Earth, but we try really hard in these analog missions to have as close of a space scenario as possible, so we can see the results of both equipment, habitat, and crew, and actually see how well we can actually convey those set experiments.
What have you learned from these missions that, say, the average person may not realize about living in space, or about what it would be like? Because I mean, I think off the top of my hands, okay, I don't know how I could do that being away from people, but obviously through this experience and these experiences you've had, you've got to learn more closer than a lot of people of what it would be like to actually be in space.
Yes, throughout both of my training and several missions that I conveyed, there's several aspects that are really different. First and foremost, you only have your crew. There's mission control, but you do have to problem solve with what you have only on those missions and your crew. So there's limited resources. There might be limited water. You might not shower. You might have limited food, and you have a limited capacity in tools and also crew capabilities. And it's a lot of systems that you have to take care about that you kind of take for granted in real life. For example, you're responsible for maintaining the whole habitat. If something were to happen, you have to fix it immediately, and you're kind of like bound in that bubble being so perfectly operated. And your schedules are really, really tough. You have to be operational from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed. We had so many workshops across the globe, and people often ask why astronauts are not also on social media and being influencers. Well, when you have a schedule where everything is pre-planned, from briefs to how much time it takes you to execute something, to a meeting, to potentially leisure time with your friends, family, or just the crew being there for you, you cannot really have another job, because social media is a job, for example, to record content in that fashion, because you are this test subject, and your whole day is planned, and you have certain protocols and lingo that you have to abide by. But most importantly, you kind of have to like maintain that bubble. That was really interesting for me, because I come from a culture where everybody's in tune with everyone else. We are so proactive when it comes to like drinking coffee. We drink 3 coffees in Macedonia on a daily basis, for example. It's a really expansing community, and you have to like just submerge that into one bubble and only rely to your crew, mission control, and occasional email or two with your friends and family.
Wow. I mean, you know how much I socialize and everybody else in this group does. So I can imagine that at some point there must be some sort of mental capacity that you have to, I don't know. I mean, there's got to be impacts mentally on you where you have to train yourself to understand, where you're at. Is that part of your training when it comes to like the mental health? And I'm sure that plays a huge role in knowing you're going to be in such an isolated area for a longer period of time.
Yes, absolutely. It does put things into perspective. For me, it gets a bit interesting when I have to commit for a longer time, because you try to get as much as time with your close ones as possible, but it does sort of like impact you both physically and mentally. For example, I started wearing glasses after my analog astronaut missions. The reason being is because when you're in confined spaces, you can only see in front of you, so you cannot really exercise your sight being rested on a longer focal length. So you cannot really stare and rest your eyes into the environment. Everything is just close quarters. So that does impact your eyes when you're into close states like that. And it's a lot of tools like that kind of compound over time for both analog astronauts and astronauts from experience, that you kind of see what confinement means to you, both mentally but also physically. It's not only the mental aspects and the isolation and the potential loneliness or the environment bringing the best or the worst out of you. It's also a lot of other physical changes that you get post missions.
That's a very interesting perspective. So, knowing what you know and having this training, what would you say would be the benefits for humans living in space, but also what would be the challenges that you see us facing right now that either we can overcome or, down the road that could still be an issue?
Well, the benefits go a long way. That's always what I try to preach when I educate about space exploration. So first and foremost, we have altruistic sort of like benefits. As a humanity, we're expanding our life and consciousness on other planets, right? We're trying to sort of like be present more proactively in our solar system. With that being said, with all of the potential of new discovery, testing new equipments, bringing new innovation back to Earth that we're going to discover in space because of the special environment that space has, we do have so many challenges. one big thing that makes a good high fidelity analog is sustainability. For example, the whole system has to function flawlessly. The whole water has to be recycled. Everything has to be mindful and reused. And you only have a specific thing you can bring with you, only one bag of things you're allowed to bring into an analog. So it does put your mind to think about how we're going to be sustainable on our planet, how we're going to manage both waste and resources, and how we're going to produce that longevity in things that last for other generations, because these equipments are not going to be easy to reproduce when you're starting new. It's going to be like the wild west a bit, where you have to like lay ground and really be mindful. So definitely how in which capacity we try to navigate that sustainably is one of the big challenges that we should respond to.
So I'm going to go into my next question. And I think after this, I'm going to open it to the group because it's definitely been a big topic in the news. And having two of our astronauts now up on the space station, and with everything going on right now, it doesn't look like they're going to get back until, I believe the latest was February. They were already supposed to be home. I mean, with situations like that, do you see that posing a lot of concern, and maybe for some people that nervousness of wanting to live and be in space?
So when it comes to short versus long duration missions, the training is a bit different. So when you have a shorter mission, like most astronauts do, like a few days, you kind of like prepare in a different way rather than a longer duration missions. From you know, putting your life on hold with your close ones to expectations to mission training, it's a bit different than when you train for long duration missions. It's a silver lining for an astronaut always when they have the chance to go to space and potentially break a record. For some, it might be challenging, but that does not mean that it's not dangerous. When I was just recently on a conference in Las Vegas where I've met Ubaldo, we had a panel that actually talked about space debris and sustainability, and that we have to be mindful about our launching capacity. When it comes to, for example, new actors in space and new regions in space, like the Balkan region that I would like to see, there's again a silver lining of how we can actually not stop them to grow into the space race, but also be sustainable. We do have to think about how we can actually deorbit satellites that's going to be beneficial, or reuse them, or not really crowd our finite orbits because they're finite. The danger there is not only from failing technology, but for potential collisions that might be present. So yeah, I try to look at the positive way and hope for the best outcome and solutions, because I know that our space sector and industry is capable and willing, but there's a lot of negative outcomes that we don't want to happen.
And I think too, you know, and everyone feel free to join in. I mean, we have to have that exit strategy, right? And I feel like recently, with what just happened with Boeing, if you don't have that backup, I mean, you think about it, how long is it going to take to get something else built that can go up there and bring our astronauts back? Or worst case scenario, if there was an emergency on the ISS and they had to get people off, I mean, does that ever concern you or anybody else about maybe we need a little more work or build more things in tandem? So if something doesn't work, we've already got a backup in the storage unit.
I mean, it's like planning anything, like planning the perfect vacation. You have to be ready for if something doesn't go wrong, if something doesn't go well and goes wrong, you have to be ready for losing your luggage, or having more finances set aside, or planning the whole trip on maps and seeing where, you know, the location is and what you have around, and just resources or connecting with people. I feel like I always say that what is great for joining the space sector if you're a planner is that you can actually see the whole picture and create those exit strategies. But if that's not happening, we really have to circle back and do that planning more intensely and have few gateways out of those set situations. But yeah, everyone, I would love to know what you guys think.
Well, I would. Oh, go ahead, Daniel.
I thought it was interesting. One of the first, one of the chores that I recognized in some of the news headlines were that they were cleaning out the urine processing unit. So you imagine the additional pull that, the air revitalization systems, waste
Yeah.
treatment systems has. It's like, okay, you got extra chores to do too, right? There's more stress is put on these systems. And that's been something for decades that we don't have life support systems to really well adapted for deep space. For LEO, there's a lot that goes up. There's a lot that comes back down with trash disposal. But in deep space, you're just not going to have that option. You go to the moon or you go to Mars, and there's resources that you bring along that could be really valuable.
And
Yeah,
that's
that's a
where the
good point.
circular sustainable moment is, right? Where you have to have everything circularly working.
Carl, I think you were gonna pop on and say
Well,
so.
yeah,
By the way,
it's
we should do intros of our other guests. Yes, Meredith, you want to do quick intros?
Oh, sure. Well, first off, thanks, Martina, for joining me for the Rocket Girl report. But it's nice because now we're going to segue into our next group of guests that we have, which is really exciting. Actually, I didn't have a chance to practice the last names for the other two. So Ubaldo or Daniel, I know
Yeah,
you
let's
guys
go.
brought
Let's
these
go.
guests
I'll
in
try.
because I know we were just talking about this. To butcher someone's last name is the worst ever. And yeah, so let's let
Totally.
our other host
Let-
introduce the guest.
Let me try this. Oh, great. See, Iman. Okay, Iman. I think I got your first name right. Iman. It's Dr. Iman Jahangir. Perfect. Is joining us. And Iman is well, first of all, you're a physician and you're an astronaut through the Moondout program. So very excited to talk and learn more about all of that because there's some questions I have related to your time at Inclusion One with one of my favorite people, Bailey Burns, at Biosphere 2, and then Martina as well. Having those analog experiences, quite different, I might imagine, but we'll talk about that. And then Carl, it's Aspelund? Oh, great. Wow, see? That's what happens when I have my name, which is Ubaldo Ciminieri, but it could go many ways, as you can imagine, but I've had to practice. So it's a pleasure to have you as well, Carl. Carl, I'm going to let you, because you were going to respond to this question. So if you don't mind popping in with a quick intro, and then, yeah, let's just dive into this conversation.
Yes, I mean, I just wanted to pick up on what Martina was talking about, which is the circularity aspect there. And as soon as we leave the Earth-Moon system, things are going to get pretty dicey on that side. I've been doing work with the 100-Year Starship Initiative now for over 10 years, and my thing there is to be looking at textiles and clothing. And basically beyond Mars, but we sort of backed up into Mars because the Starship was freaking everybody out. But the idea that whatever goes on that ship, that's what you've got, and if you can't turn that into a circular process, you're going to wind up with some pretty cold and naked astronauts before you reach the Oort cloud. And
Right.
so I'm an anthropologist of material culture as well as a textile designer, and so I started off in costumes and theater, but the anthropologist hat goes on, and suddenly it's this idea of creating culture. And so what is in that bag? What do you choose to put in that bag, and what do you bring with you, and how do we instruct these crews eventually who are going to be on Mars and beyond in what might be a smart move to what do you put in that bag, and not just for you, but for the community you're joining, so that the complexity level rises really fast.
So
Even
I
while
can,
the things get smaller. Yeah.
sorry about that. I overstepped. I can relate to the flight suits. Any training that I had when it comes to just planes and training at NASA, or in general training in analog missions, every flight suit I had was for men's sizes, so it was always baggy on me, and I always had to somehow strap myself to fit more. It was really baggy, and it was not fit to for women, first and foremost. And second, from experience, what you put in those bags really helps. Sometimes just having that work mindset and having your flight suit on at all times can be a bit strenuous because you can never really relax. So having like a personal item, like a favorite snuggly t-shirt or something that you can really unwind in is really amazing. I carry a plush octopus with me that represents many things, but I often use it. And there's actually been studies in Asia done with another plush. I'm not sure if it was a whale or something like that, where it had some AI integration and it really boosted crew morale. So we actually 3D printed some things, and we've had companions for that octopus of mine. It was quite an interactive thing that it kind of like brought laughter and it brought like comfort, and we had conversational pieces in some of the hubs I visited. So having both useful but also things that you cope with is amazing. On one analog, we could actually have letters opened. So all of my followings across social media send me letters from all across the globe that brought so many emotions when we were reading them at hard times, because you are cut off of the world. You're not using social media. You don't have that connection. And if you are one of the novel generations, or if you're dopamine addicted and your dopamine circuits are a bit fried, you're not going to have an easy time. You're basically going into healing that addiction. You're trying to really like get off. We've had some crew members being on the younger spectrum and really miss that connection, and battle it for the first few days.
I think going back to and thinking about COVID, I mean, if we all want to put ourselves in a situation where we were isolated and we really couldn't go out, I mean, maybe you'll agree with me, Martina or Carl, or anyone in this particular matter. I mean, think about that. And maybe when we're thinking about living in space, go back to COVID. You know, what got you through? What helped you mentally? You know, what did you need that you didn't have?
Well, I can sort of turn that inside out for you, because during COVID, we actually developed a course here at URI where we had a group of students, and we would meet on Zoom and have the asynchronous thing. But the conceit of the course was that we were all in space.
Wow.
Oh, interesting.
And that
Interesting.
we had to engage. Well, we were obviously investigating things and studying literature and so on and so forth. But the conceit was that each person was in a station somewhere out there and isolated, and so they were sharing their experiences of that. And it was a really interesting thing. This was the first COVID spring. Once the weather got decent, we actually had them go outside as if they were leaving the hab.
Wow.
and do a square yard investigation of the soil outside their hab and so on and so forth. So,
Well,
Daniel, that's right up your alley.
That's awesome. I wanted to talk to Iman, because so you were at Biosphere too, and I've been there, and that's, so speaking of habitats, I mean, I could live in there. You know, like the creature comforts of everything you might ever want are located in there. Can you talk about your experience as it relates to this? Because it feels like it would be less, it's, I mean, you'd have everything you might ever want to feel human, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes back to a lot of the stuff Martina was saying. We actually did have a therapeutic AI seal with us, and some of the crew found it useful and some did not. So I think when it comes down to those kinds of things, it really depends on the person. But at the end of the day, I think the hard parts of being in a confined space are the ones that have kind of been touched on, which are resources, which in COVID, that was less of an issue because I could get on Uber Eats or DoorDash and have ice cream delivered to me, and that was my creature comfort. Or, you know, I could have a handle of my favorite alcohol delivered. That was not available when you were in the analog. And while there may be some when you get to Mars or the moon, it's going to be a limited resource, right? And so you're going to probably save that for necessary ends. The other aspect of it, I think, is the day-to-day chores that we don't think about, right? Because when we live here on Earth, we are using resources like we think they're infinite, even though you could argue they are not. And when we were in the biosphere, we were actually recycling water, and some of our filters worked well, some of them did not. So then you have to troubleshoot what's going on with this, because we would like to use this water, maybe not to drink, but to bathe or, you know, use to wash something. So I think that, the big benefit of these analog missions are that they allow us to test things. In our case, we did that artificial intelligence still before trying to send them to space, because as you know, right now, the limiting step to getting things to space is mass. And you do not want to spend that money to send something up to space if it hasn't at least passed preliminary testing here on Earth. The other real benefit to these analogs are the sociologic, anthropologic aspects of things. There's a great book called Seven Eve where the Earth kind of ends, and there's a group that lives underground, a group that lives in the water, and a group that lives in space. And culturally, they develop differently. And it's not just because they're different people, because some of the people are from the same family and culture structures, but it's because of the resources they have, which goes back to what Carl was saying. Like, if you have certain textiles or you have encyclopedias versus digital books, how does that change who we become when we go off to, far, far away from where we live? And the aspect we don't really talk about is all of the medical stuff, because, that is a real issue. And it's something that NASA thinks about. But even these discussions of going to Mars, let's say we figure out the radiation issue, which is probably the number one limitation. But let's say we can get to Mars safely. Now you've had astronauts flying for 6 months in, low gravity. Their bones are brittle. They haven't really been, maybe they've been keeping up with their muscle. And we, the astronauts who even work out are losing bone mass. It's not like they're maintaining like we do here on Earth, because there's just unloading. And now you land on Mars, which is less gravity than we have on Earth, but still has gravity. And they have to get up and, get a habitat ready or set up where they're going to live, transfer themselves from the ship to the next thing. How long is it going to take for them to actually get strong enough to do that? Is it going to take a week? What if they get up and they break a bone? Who fixes that? How do we fix that all the way out on Mars without the resource we have? So there are so many facets of this that really touch on everything we do, everything humans do, from textiles to medicine to the social aspect of it, if you're going to talk about social media. And I think NASA does a good job of thinking of the science, but they don't necessarily, at least traditionally, they haven't thought of the other aspects of humanity that need to be brought with them.
Well, and I think a big part of that, and something, Sam talks a lot about, is just design, design of the habitat. So just thinking terrestrially, right? Like, I think biosphere 2, the reason why I refer back to that is because you have an ocean, you have a rainforest, right? You have plants, right? Daniel, like, you plants are such a big deal, just not only from a food perspective, but I think also from a creature comfort, like, being surrounded by green. And but whereas Martina, where I think I'm not sure about the habitats exactly that you've been in, but they probably felt a little more stale, right? Like, was there wood paneling, like things like that aren't necessarily taken into consideration, right?
Every habitat is a bit different that I've been at. One that did have the wood paneling, actually, which was quite a nice touch. The two of them actually had a module only for greenery. So in two of the habitats that we only had module for greenery separately, where we could actually grow plants and even meditate with plants. It was quite an amazing experience watching something that looks great and just like a medical building before turn into a green forest after some period of time, because of your investment with the crew, the bonds and the systems you've actually put in place. So we did a lot of research in growing plants, but it definitely changes. For example, on some missions, we've only ate freeze-dried food. That was it. We only had to dissolve that. So having a plant and just changing the taste just a bit does matter and does go a long way. It's such a crew bonding time. We also had to document the plants that we're growing, etc., for various experiences. So gathering to do that together and put it in the food afterwards was really, really interesting to experience.
And when you go from microgravity, even like food preparation and just living, like, okay, there's the microgravity aspect of the in transit activity, but then once you're on the surface of Mars, you have a partial gravity. So it's like, okay, it's that like meal you're looking forward to on Mars. Once you have some gravity, it's like, oh, I can finally make, or prepare this or whatnot. Maybe an interesting element that we haven't yet really explored yet in space. When we went to the moon, it was a lot of prepackaged food, right? We weren't staying for extended periods of time on the moon or Mars. And that's, I think, something that's kind of underrated, because things get a little bit easier, right? Once you're under partial gravity, the system, right? Water flows, you have convection, you have things kind of start operating a little bit more similarly, from a life standpoint. So, yeah, on the food preparation side, that was a big element of SAM at Biosphere. It was the food element there. I had a question. Was this your first analog mission that you had done?
It was actually my first analog, yeah, and we were in there for 6 days. It was a crew of 4. And we didn't have access to internet. We had like delayed email, like if we were living on the moon. And everything we had was freeze dried or dehydrated, food that we used to cook, though we did have live plants that, we could add to it. But it was interesting because, some of the food tasted better with the plants, and sometimes you'd taste the plants and they'd be bitter, but you wouldn't have anything to offset that with, right? Like we would in the kitchen here. So
no ketchup in space.
we did not have ketchup. Yeah, I guess and the water resources too, because you always wanted to be conscientious of your water utilization. I think my next analog, if we did it at Biosphere 2 again, I would be much more prepared. The other interesting thing, if you go back to the original Biosphere 2, where they had people living there for years, is that as they were growing plants, and as you've mentioned, they had a full rainforest and crops, animals, the tools got infected by, I think, a fungus, and they didn't realize it, and they transferred that fungus from one crop to another.
Oh, wow.
And so they had their expectation was that they were going to have all this food source, but in reality, a lot of their crops failed because they inadvertently were transferring this fungus without cleaning their tools properly.
Yeah,
so
when you take life into a new environment, you often see this in controlled environment agriculture. You see it in like vertical greenhouses. You say, oh, we're getting away from all those problems in the field. Well, you get these really new problems. You get things like powdery mildew on tomatoes that you would never get out in a field environment. So once you change that environment, biology happens differently. You get different diseases, both human and non-human, right? That manifest.
I think that's why it's important too. Like, I mean, we look at a lot of the research that's being done right now on the ISS, and these are things that are underway, testing to see if there's something that grows that, it fights against antibiotics, and you can't use an antibiotic to cure it. I mean, I think that's why it's important. Now we're doing so many of these tests. And I think for people on Earth to understand that we have to do all these tests and spend this money to do these tests, because we have to be prepared for that. What if something grew on space, and that's your mission, or that's your trip for tourists to a space hotel, and all of a sudden something happens? We need to have had that experience of what to do and prepare.
Carl, I think you had
yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the other side of one other side of plant life, and Daniel and I have had a conversation about this a while back. But that's the emotional and mental side of having plant life around you. And I was involved in a HAB in a simulation similar to what you just described, about a week long, 4-person crew. And things did not go well. Their mission was off to a really bad start right from the get-go. And their safe space became the greenhouse. And the crew members would be rotating. I shouldn't laugh. They were rotating in and out of the greenhouse, and using that as a place to calm down and get their wits back. It was quite something to see.
It's interesting. We're intuitively drawn to these changing landscapes and the resources that they kind of provide. It's like, oh, what's going to come up next? Like it's very built into our DNA. Oh, is that going to be edible, right? Or hey, is that eating the food that I want to eat? It's this really innate. I just spent the last 2 weeks traveling around the Western on a road trip around the Western United States, and the beauty and the legibility of the landscape, right? Whether you're surrounded by thousands of square miles in Yellowstone National Park, or you're very much in a very small kitchen garden, right? With the plants growing and everything like that. There's that underlying, hey, things are changing, things are getting better, or hey, maybe I can make them better, that really goes underappreciated until you're in one of those situations, I think.
Well, and that's sort of the underlying, I think, point of this conversation is, we have to take all of these things into consideration when we're talking about working and living and traveling through space. Because to Carl's point about the emotional and psychological aspect of it, to Iman's point about the physical, medical side of it, right? Like it's oftentimes, and I think up until recently, we really haven't considered those human pieces of this, of space travel. Again, talking about Sam, like they wouldn't even talk about sex in space, but guess what? We're human. We're going to have sex in space, or we're going to drink booze. I mean, that's going to happen. So why not plan for it instead of letting it happen naturally as it will, or unnaturally and illegally, potentially. I don't know if you all watched For All Mankind, but last season they sort of touched on that in For All Mankind, right? And you've got these underground establishments happening. Why not plan for it? Because it's going to happen. And so I think that's what's always interesting to me is why is it taking so long to remember that, hey, guess what, we're human and we're taking our humanity with us no matter where we go.
And it seems like it's on a generational cycle. If you look back in the literature, I recently completed a fellowship where it really dug into the literature around these life systems in space. And it goes back all the way to the 1800s, where people were envisioning, greenhouses on the moon and stuff, identifying, oh, we're going to need all these things. And there's kind of this, right? Even if you think of something as simple as the water cycle, right here on Earth, there's these large scale reuses of materials that kind of Earth sets as an example. And it's interesting that every about 25 years, we revisit it with new technology. AI pops up, or LEDs for plant growth, lighting pop up, and we've got new energy efficiency. And one thing that we just take really for granted, and biosphere comes close to this by increasing the buffer of air and water, is that we just don't operate these systems in a sealed environment. And there's no use case for it. Even submarines or the International Space Station are not a fully closed environment.
Yeah.
And you don't have to go to the moon or Mars to test these systems. Right now, for $1 billion, you couldn't put yourself in a bubble for 6 months and survive. No bubble exists to really do that. So that's I think an underrated element that just doesn't have a cure. Coming from the plant doctor side of me, looking for, okay, where is the problem in this biological systems engineering, or on this farm or in this greenhouse. And it seems like that, as much as it's been demonstrated, parts of it have been tested. And increasingly here on Earth, as resources are becoming constrained, we're wondering, where does that nitrogen come from, right? Where does all the nitrogen for our agricultural fields? It's all coming from natural gas ultimately. So how do we do that? Wastewater treatment. How do we do wastewater treatment better? It's increasingly relevant to solve for a sealed system here on Earth, because as we are on this spaceship Earth, it's really coming to another bottleneck. And it's interesting that all of the push out to space is right alongside with it. It's this known constraint. How do we outpace entropy? How do we do things differently? How do we keep on growing and expanding? I think is that was always, for me, I was never a space person until about 5 years ago. Very accidentally kind of came into it, but I always had that ethos of, long-term thinking of, how do we create conditions for thriving in the future? And, a lot of this comes down to just living very differently, but also living in a way that's expandable and relevant. I think a lot of these challenges are super relevant. There's a billion people that lack access to a flush toilet on Earth. That's a very unknown thought, but how relevant is that to efforts in the wastewater treatment arena, where they're looking at decentralized wastewater treatment, smaller systems that are more energy efficient and environmentally friendly, to solve for that, because you may not be able to put in the massive infrastructure it takes to do traditional large scale wastewater treatment. So it's interesting seeing all these life touch points being developed in what I call the hidden space community, which is things that they don't think they're even solving for space. Things like wastewater or, different methods of food production. And I think that's increasingly coming to kind of a convergence that may tip the scale. But again, we still use the massive buffer of air and water here on Earth. So, how do you get away from that and absolutely operate in a sealed environment? It's still going to be a big leap to actually push that forward. And I don't know if there's a clear return on it.
Well, I can add to that in that over these years, I mean, now it's been 12 years with the 100-year Starship Initiative. My research has increasingly been coming back to Earth, Daniel, and the incredibly destructive and polluting apparel industry that I've also been a part of for the past 30 years really requires some adjustment, to say the least. And if you're going to be able to create that loop, that closed loop of plastics and polyester, in order to maintain a Starship mission or a Mars mission, you've solved that for the apparel industry on Earth. And so why not solve it for the apparel industry on Earth in the first place? And so we're getting to that point now where it doesn't really matter whether the research is for Mars or for Minnesota. I mean, it just comes down to the same problem and the same issues. We need this to survive on this planet.
Yeah, so much of what we do for space, contributes back to Earth, but we don't think of it the opposite way, which is what you're pointing at, which is if we looked at these problems like we were on the Starship now, we'd probably all be doing better. But I think, humankind, unfortunately, as a mass, doesn't seem particularly interested, right? Greed wins, often on these big conglomerate type missions. Humans don't want to really lock themselves up. You hear about like the hero program and things like that, where people lock themselves up for a year or 18 months. Most people look at that and they're like, what are these people doing? Like, that is not considered a normal, in our cultural like way of thinking of like going without privilege and going without like the comforts for 18 months. So we have a long way to go, but that's, I think, why you need people like in this community from all walks of life to push the boundaries, make those connections, make people think about this, because otherwise we won't see progress unless we include everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it also, it makes me think of a lot of conversations I've had with advocates for, the homeless population, right? And solving for that, and these are people who are looking into the space community for new ideas, because again, as humanity, as you've all pointed out, like, we don't want to take a lot of this stuff with us. Homelessness, food security, or food insecurities and things like that. And so, how do we do that? But one point that always sticks out in these conversations is, well, trying to convince the mother who, only has a few dollars to buy food for her family, to trying to convince them to care about what we're doing in space right now. You're not going to, right? And so I don't know, how do we do that, right? Because ultimately, yes, we in this community, we love space and we know the potential there, and we want to achieve that together. But we also know that it's going to take way more than just our currently kind of small community in comparison to the rest of the world, right? Like, how do we do that? How do we convince the rest of the world who doesn't care, or who doesn't want to leave their creature comforts, to your point, Iman, who doesn't want to go to space? How do we convince them that we need their voice to make it happen, even though they don't want to go?
And I think there's a line there with palatability too, because on the Lunar Palace in China, where it was a 370-day sealed mission, they actually, it's interesting, the Chinese referenced the UN's proposals for using mealworms as a protein substitute. And they ate mealworms. The mealworms ate a lot of the inedible portions of the plant. You harvest the tomato and the rest of the plant, the mealworms eat, and then you eat the mealworms. It was really interesting that there was a lot of obvious backlash. unpalatability to that as a solution. But it's interesting that, that's the very same, that did have a ground base to it with some of the most basic human needs. And it's finding that line, where how do you have a palatable, future, right? That's whatever your vision is, whether it's eating insects versus eating animals, or, how do you envision, how do you live like you're living in the future? I often think of it as how my kids are going to live in 50 years or whatnot. Is that I think of it in that kind of framework, is saying, okay, is this something that I could do again in 50 years? And if not, like, okay, how do you transition to, envisioning or going in the direction to support kind of future endeavors? So I think from accessibility, it may not be the most pleasant experience, cultivating your own mealworms and eating some, for one snack a year or something like that. But it doesn't have to be super high tech, some of these futuristic elements. You just have to kind of think of them differently. And then it gets maybe a little bit more palatable and exciting.
I think
oh, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, no, that's fine. So I think from the communications aspect and my background in journalism and the broadcast media, I mean, it's getting these stories told, right? I mean, you've got people on social media that are doing things, but at the end of the day, you still have the general public that's looking to the journalists, that's looking to the reporters, and they're looking for the stories to be told, but getting the truth out there. And I think that's where something like this is good, getting these topics out there and having those trustworthy sources. And it's for people like Martina and Carl and Iman, like going out and, telling these stories. I mean, I write for space.com, and I can tell you so many of the stories that come through there. I can't tell you the amount of feedback that I get from people that read these articles, and they're like, wow, like, I didn't know that. And then being able to include in there, yes, this is what we're doing in space, but here's how it impacts you on Earth. And I think, the government's starting to do a better job with communicating that, especially through NASA and these stories. But I think a lot of the private space companies too, I mean, in these press releases, in these interviews and articles that they're doing, getting the facts out there and showing people the benefits, how it's benefiting Earth from space and vice versa.
So space is all around us. It's in your pocket, it's in your home, it's in your kitchen, and it's in your bedroom. But space is not for all of us. It's still inaccessible. So one thing to have in mind is that some regions have it really hard to penetrate. It is so easy. There's so many studies conveyed about harsh conditions. So if there's a region that's really struggling, impoverished, developing, in war, they're going to care about their primal necessities being met first, right? It is really easy when you're coming from a cushioned spot, from a sense of a different privilege, to care about the more altruistic motives of things. But we do have to perhaps showcase how some space technologies contribute to solving problems on Earth, like, solving diseases, solving accessibility, doing things in a more sustainable manner. So I usually have two scenarios. One scenario is people asking me, why should we care about space? And the next scenario is people saying, oh, I'm gonna be dead in 50, 60, 70 years. Why does it matter for future generations? So first, we're losing a lot of compassion and a lot of community, which is the individualistic aspect of development, and just the self-centeredness of development kind of like gets us not think about future generations, which is really, really tragic. We have to practice more compassion and offering a helping hand and hoping for the future. But secondly, also penetrating those regions and solving their problems through space, opening new jobs there, showing how the tools are used, and having diverse advocates in bringing whole humanity to solve problems together is crucial, because we know, and we've shown times and times again, that more diverse teams solve problems better. So yeah, we need more palatable solutions, like Ayman actually said, but we need to bring everyone's idea on board through platforming, advocacy, and giving opportunities.
Anything else anyone wants to add on this topic? I know we're getting.
I was gonna say, I felt like that was
session,
like a mic drop.
Go right ahead.
That was good, Martina. No, that's true. And that's where I think using new forms of media, I was talking we're interviewing people for like nurse practitioner roles. And it's like, how do you train the young nurse practitioners because they don't have experience? And it goes back to what you're saying is, or we were talking about this yesterday, the way of teaching people has changed. We don't need to just like go and have a lecture at a conference and say, this is the future of space. We need people like you, Martina, on social media. We need people like Meredith, who is on, you know, some traditional media sources like magazines and TV and newspapers. We need podcasts like this, because if you could be doing all the great work in the world, but if you don't express that work and share it with other people, no one will ever know why it's important. And
That's
so
true.
I hope that our voices get louder, particularly since 2021, when commercial space has become a bigger and a true entity where there are more opportunities for people to go to space and see space, that we as a community continue to grow and share with the non-space community what we're doing and why this is important and how this impacts them. And so I think the way you ended it there, Martina, was absolutely correct, that we need to be out there.
That and overlapping industries. I do find so many bubbles. Like the space sector has its own thing, and then the IT sector, which is not too far away, is having their own another thing. So binding industries together is so important. That's why on so many events that I create, I have actors there, singers there, just media people and makers and the creatives and even lawyers and accountants present to immerse them and welcome them. And I think that people don't understand that the more we popularize space, for example, I come from a country that our industries are a bit more traditional. We still haven't picked up on like the TikTok marketing for companies, or even space agencies are more traditional and they're not picking up on IG trends. Some of them are, which is really refreshing, but some of them are not. They're not in tune with some of the novel times and the novel generations who will turn to be their workforce. If we don't popularize that, we're going to lose the interest. And if we're losing the interest and the hype about it, that means less college degrees for that, less money in our industry, less spin-offs, and eventually that industry will sort of like silence that. And also community. For example, you, Ayman, you've been really profound in lending your own hand to fly something that's really important for my region on your space flight. So just if we can reflect how we all support each other, being diverse and incredible and authentic, yet still together in the space sector across industries, and invite everyone over. First, we're going to have more money to leverage and build and promote, and then more capacity.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I think it starts with like inviting all of those different voices to become a part of this conversation, right? And for all the things you just said, Martina, because it should be, right? We're like, you know, Frank White always says, we're on Spaceship Earth, we're all astronauts. Like this is an opportunity for all of us, whether we want to take that opportunity or not. Our voice should still have that opportunity to be heard. And so I love that. I think this is one of those conversations where we could just keep talking about all of this stuff. And so I unfortunately we can't, but we can always do a part 2. But I did want to kind of put it out there for everybody, like, just some last thoughts that, from your perspective on this topic. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I mean, space has powerful branding along with it. If the story is relevant to different things. I mean, talking about the future of agriculture doesn't nearly sound as interesting as like Mars agriculture, right? Or space agriculture, or space wastewater treatment, right? So there's a lot of these industries that have traditionally operated like the textile industry for going on 100 years now, right? With a lack of sustainability. In going towards the future, going towards different resource utilizations. Mm-hmm. So, how do you get people into these kind of traditional, kind of not growing industries or not exciting industries? I mean, that's something that NASA does good as like a workforce development program. A lot of that goes off in other directions, but I think, the living in space and staying in space and all this, these futuristic space settlement ideas, they actually have much more applicability from like a basic resources level that is often overlooked. If we can thrive in space on the moon or Mars, you can thrive anywhere on Earth. That's the slogan that I use. Like, that's what we're solving for. Starting with a small little metal can, right? If you can expand out of that or just survive sustainably in that, that's an order that really shows that it doesn't matter where you are and what resources you have, because there are none truly out there, right? There's very basic materials, but it's definitely opens the door to an inspiring future.
And I find that that's the beauty of this, Daniel, is that the ability to frame the research I'm doing in that space framework, it just becomes this focusing element of the urgency of the problem, where you can like, nobody wants to think about the fact that, okay, we're going to have all these naked astronauts, but wait a minute, it's a problem on Earth. We're not going to be able to sustain this. And but the focusing out of it, it's like you say, if you're doing it for Mars, everybody gets very interested. If you're doing it for Wakefield, Rhode Island, they're like, yeah, talk to me tomorrow. So it focuses the urgency. I think that's really great.
I agree. Martina, or would you guys, either of our other guests, want to add one last final thought to this?
Yes, absolutely. I'm really hopeful about the future of space exploration, especially when I come across actors or individuals that offer lending hands, that are willing to educate and bring diversity forward and inclusion. And yeah, I think the more we unite, the more we communicate, the more we try to collectively solve problems, the better our answers are going to be. So this is just one way forward of us coming together from all diverse aspects and contributing. So thank you, Meredith, and everybody else who contributed to this.
And I would say, as a cardiologist, I think we need to have a heart for space. So we need to bring compassion up there and have true dedication to it. I look forward to going to space on the next New Shepard flight, which is happening shortly, though I cannot announce when, and at least can come back here and tell you what it's like looking at it from outside the artwork, as one of the astronauts previously had said, as opposed to being in the artwork. So I'm pretty excited.
I think everybody said it well. I mean, it's compassion. It's us with that passion, getting out there, whether it's talking to our friends or family, whether it's writing a story or going on LinkedIn and doing a post, whether it's going to conferences and speaking. I mean, that's what this is about, conversations. And it all starts with storytelling, with taking our personal experiences and stirring inside others the beauty of what's to come, and how what we are doing now is paving the way, just like our ancestors did. And I'm sure they would be so proud to see how far we've come. And now we have a responsibility and we have a job of what's coming next. And then for them, what's going to come next after that. So thank you, everybody, so much, for our guests, for our hosts, for joining us for this month's Conversations for the Future Liftoff. We know you're going to join us next month, so get ready. And of course, we always love your feedback. If there's topics you think that you might want to hear about, or you would love to see us talk about, or if you're interested in being a guest on our show, or have a suggestion of somebody who you'd love to hear from. So from the Rocket Girl reporting to end this today, thank you so much, and we'll see you next month.